All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Albertson. I am the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to join us for one of our CGSR lecture series. And today, we are very pleased to welcome a friend of CGSR, Dr. Phil Saunders, who is the Director of the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs at the National Defense University. And his talk today is titled Assessing China's Strategic Relationships, a Conceptual Overview. So, if you have been tuning into CGSR lectures, and they're all available on the website if people would like to go back and watch recordings of past ones, you will know that we have had many talks on China recently. China remains the pacing threat. Whatever else is going on in U.S. national security policy, China seems to be at the center of it. And there is a lot of talk about Chinese partnerships. What is China doing in terms of foreign relations? This idea of a new axis with Russia, a strategic partnership with Russia, its relationships with countries like North Korea and Iran that are concerned with the United States. There's the Belt and Road Initiative, which of course China has been using to sort of gain economic leverage and political leverage over a number of countries. Competition for rare minerals in places like Africa, Chinese relationship with NATO, what they're doing with the European Union, Latin America, and so on. And sort of China is everywhere, and their relations are sort of everywhere. But this is an important topic because China sees these relationships in a certain way. And Dr. Saunders is going to talk more about this. So we've talked a lot about sort of military things, and now we're going to talk a little bit about sort of foreign policy things and sort of bigger picture strategic stuff. So I think this is a great talk and a great time for this talk. So let me just say a little bit about the speaker. So Dr. Saunders, as I said, is the director of the Center for Study of Chinese Military Affairs at the National Defense University's Institute for National Security Studies. He's also an adjunct instructor at Johns Hopkins University School of International Studies. He has a PhD from Princeton School of Public International Affairs. He has co-authored a recent book with Joel Lefnow, who I think has also given a CGSR lecture recently, called China's Quest for Military Supremacy. And he's also just widely written a number of things. So if you Google his name and China, a lot of different stuff will come up. But I will put a link to his most recent book here as he gets started with his remarks, so you can take a look at that and decide if it's something you'd like to read further. The ground rules, for those of you not familiar with CGSR talks, the speaker is going to present for maybe 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes. At any point in time, while Dr. Saunders is speaking, feel free to get your hand up electronically using the little hand raise button at the bottom of the WebEx link, or just submit your questions in the chat to me, to all the panelists, and that way I can get the questions and the discussion rolling as quickly as possible once the slides are done and the remarks are concluded. So Phil, thank you again for taking the time to be with us. I'm really looking forward to this presentation, and over to you.
Great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you. I wish I was there physically rather than virtually. I'm having some kind of withdrawal from California. I miss it more and more each week. It feels like, but of course we're under a travel ban, so I can't make it there physically. What I'm going to do today is tell you what I think is the right way to think about China's strategic relationships. This is a paper I gave presented in Europe in the fall. It is the centerpiece of a conference we did in November and a larger project that I'll talk about at the end. But it also reflects a lot of other work on the Chinese military, China's strategic partnerships, China's military diplomacy. So a number of other things that are published or are in the works. And I'm going to try to stay mostly to the conceptual level. I will illustrate this by talking about China-Russia relations, but the framework is intended to apply more broadly than that. And when I get to the end, I'll speak to that a little bit. And then once we're done with the framework, we can kind of go wherever the audience wants to go in terms of applications or specific questions. All right, so that's what I have in mind. I'm supposed to always make the point that these are my own views, not those of NDU, Department of Defense, or the US government. So we'll take that as read. Let's go on to the first slide. So partly this work is because there is such disagreement about the China-Russia strategic relationship. Everybody agrees it's important, but nobody quite agrees on how to understand it. What is the nature of the relationship? What is the depth of strategic cooperation and alignment? And so this topic, my interest in this topic is partly to try to cut through and make sense of how to think about this relationship. And if we listen to China and Russia, this is a no limits partnership that has already surpassed the Cold War Sino-Soviet alliance. No limit to the cooperation. But if we look at different analysts, they have very, very different takes on this. Some see this as close to a functional military alliance. There's various language used, a quasi-alliance, a semi-alliance. Others see a lot of strategic cooperation, a lot of alignment, but something that is still pretty short of an alliance and not likely to become one. And I would say that's maybe a dominant view. And then there's a third group of analysts that look at the relationship and see it as really pretty shallow and pretty transactional, that this is still on the basis of each country's individual interests, and that puts inherent limits on how far it will go. And my broad argument is this disagreement is based on a conceptual confusion about how to think about both current and future strategic cooperation and the challenges of doing this in ambiguous relationships that lack concrete security commitments. So there's a conceptual confusion. I am going to try to set everybody straight on it. But as I do that, I'm going to do so with an eye on the big picture question. Because I think what we really want to know as we're reading all of this scholarship, as we're looking at what goes on between China and Russia strategically, is we can observe what's happening today, and there isn't all that much disagreement about the facts of the case, but a lot of disagreement about how to interpret it, and disagreement about what we really want to know. How far will it go? What are the limits to strategic cooperation in extreme circumstances? And of course, the most extreme of circumstances are in a military crisis or conflict. Will they support each other under those extreme circumstances? So I have that as the big picture question in mind. And that's sort of the challenge for IR theory. That's the challenge for intelligence analysis. You have what you know today, but tell me something important about how far that will go or how it'll play out in the future. So that's what we're trying to do. We're hunting big game today. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this starts because we think about this still using the language of alliances, but they don't really fit the modern world that well. So I'm going to talk in terms of strategic relationships. So the classic treaty-based alliance with security guarantees are very rare in today's modern world. A lot of those involve the United States, and those typically have broad, enduring, institutionalized cooperation, and they don't fit a lot of other cases. And in many cases, they were established decades ago and still continue. So that traditional model of an alliance isn't very applicable to today's world. And of course, it's also possible to have very significant strategic and military cooperation without a formal alliance. So alliance, non-alliance doesn't exactly help us that much. And I think what, in fact, we see in a lot of the literature and in a lot of the policy debate is a tendency to relax that alliance criteria or to add the new one, the axis criteria, to encompass and explain any strategic cooperation. So we see a lot of imprecise terminology that borrows that language of alliance to connote strategic importance of whatever cooperation is going on. And all these are real terms from the literature: a virtual alliance, a near alliance, a quasi-alliance, an access of autocracy. But what's really going on here is imprecision, and it's using the alliance as sort of a scare quote, an intensifier. Hey, pay attention to this cooperation. Where I thought I was going with this work was to have precise definitions and figure out where each relationship fit. And And that turned out to be a lot more challenging than I thought. And as you'll see, I took a different approach. Um, but this is an area where IR theory can help us. It considers alliances to be a special case of alignment, which encompasses a range of security cooperation defined variously. So you have an alliance, which is usually a military focus, usually extensive and enduring cooperation, usually formal security guarantees as part of that alliance, often in the form of a treaty. And that contrasts with coalitions, which can have a broader focus, can sometimes be issue specific and time limited. They don't include security guarantees, but they can produce significant security cooperation for a particular issue and a wide range of possible issues. You can have a security community, which is a defined set of states with institutions and practices that produce peace. And there, the emphasis is on community and the ways the states interact with each other. You can have a strategic partnership. And I would say that most of what we're talking about is a kind of strategic partnership, although there's some issues with how China uses that language. And that's defined as structured collaboration to exploit economic opportunities or address security challenges more effectively. And I think most of the relationships we're looking at from China's point of view fall in that category of strategic partnership. And then there's other terminologies, concerts, ententes, non-aggression pacts, all this stuff from the classic diplomatic history and IR theory. And originally I thought, well, let's have the list of all the different types of relationships and let's see where everybody fits. But it really didn't work that well in dealing with China because one, they don't really do alliances, and two, everything clustered in under the strategic partnership or strategic relationship label. And so what I felt was really needed is a way to think about what's involved in a strategic partnership. How strong is it? What does it include? And a little more precision from a conceptual level there. That said, I still think while we want to use the language of alignment and strategic partnership, alliances still are a useful benchmark because they represent the deepest kind of strategic cooperation and they usually include explicit security commitments. And for our kind of broader project of saying how well will today's strategic cooperation fit future strategic circumstances, where are the limits to this, how will it play out in an extreme circumstance, an alliance gives us a good benchmark for sort of the top end of that and a way to gauge other partnerships. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So my argument here is the first thing we want to do is we want to measure today's strategic cooperation. And how do we want to measure it? We want to look at the breadth. Is it just on one or two issues, which is more like a coalition? Or does it cover a wide range of issues? We want to look at the depth of cooperation. Is this ad hoc on a case-by-case basis? Or is it enduring cooperation that's institutionalized? And because we have that adjective strategic there, we want to know if they're cooperating on areas of strategic importance. So those are the three criteria for measuring cooperation. Well, that sort of begs the question, okay, what do you mean strategic importance? So I tried to come up with five categories that I thought kind of met this task. One of those is economic, looking at goods and services vital for a peacetime and wartime economy, encompasses energy, strategic minerals, intermediate components for manufacturing, in some cases food might be one of those if you're a country like China or North Korea that is not self-sufficient. But in today's economy, it's a high-tech competitive economy. So I have a second category here about cooperation in high technology critical to national competitiveness. And this is sort of traditional manufacturing and things like machine tools, advanced manufacturing, integrated circuits. It might also include software things that are economically important. Then we have a military category looking mainly at hardware, so military systems and tech transfer. weapons, spare parts, defense technology, associated technical support. So that's a classic kind of area for military cooperation. But it's not just hardware. It is a world where the software side is increasingly important for military capability. So military advisors, military education, exercises, things that help a military improve its independent capability and potentially its interoperability with partners. And then finally, having done economic and military, there's also a diplomatic piece of this. So diplomatic cooperation to build coalitions against common threats, strengthen the influence of the partners, shape international rule of norms. I think those things qualify as strategic. So when I say strategic, that's the 5 sets of things that I have in mind. And I will throw out there a little heuristic. Is a country willing to rely on an adversary as a major source of particular goods and services, whether those are hardware or software? If they're not willing to do it, that's an indicator that that particular area of cooperation may have strategic value, strategic significance. Okay, so that's sort of a way of looking at today's cooperation. Let's go to the next slide, please. And a couple things that I want to call out on that. So at the top level, how much of this cooperation is areas of strategic importance? Again, those criteria, is it broad-based, institutionalized, and enduring? That's all good. Or is it issue-specific, shallow, and time-limited? That suggests more limited cooperation, more transactional. I wanted to try to throw in something about motive, which is always challenging. But I want to note that some kinds of cooperation may exist not really based on strategic motives. It may be about profit, it may be about market. And you can take as an example of this Russian arms sales to China in the early 1990s. The Russian arm industry post USSR was in a state of free fall, and they were willing to sell arms to anybody who had the cash to buy them. And so that's not really necessarily strategic cooperation. That is about making money. You can also have cooperation that's routine, that happens. It serves common interests, but it doesn't matter very much strategically. And so I threw in international mail delivery maybe as an example of that, although you could argue between the US and China, that's an important economic issue today. But you can have cooperation that's based on strategic motives or not based on it. And I think that's an important consideration. Another fact of assessing today's cooperation is how much of that is based on each partner's ability to make independent decisions about where to cooperate, about how much to cooperate, and how much of it is shaped by power relationships or need relationships. And what we're trying to do here is assess current cooperation and what does that tell us about commitment. And if the current choices of cooperation are partly based on power, if they're partly coerced, then today's cooperation might not be such a good indicator of a partner's commitment to the relationship or what they're willing to do for their partner in more extreme circumstances. So again, I'm saying today's cooperation is what we want to focus on. That's the best indicator we have. But we have to qualify it in a couple ways to understand, is it freely chosen? Is it based on the market? Is it the workings of power relationships that don't really get us to commitment? Let's go to the next slide. Now, of course, the classic way to talk about this is where are the areas of common interest? Where are the areas of conflicting interest? And I certainly would agree with that. Common interests provide a basis for cooperation. There are potential gains from cooperation in a limited way, and there's potential greater gains for deeper cooperation. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. And then on the other hand, there are conflicting interests, and those impose limits on cooperation. And you worry about those things. If states have unresolved territorial disputes, that's a limit. If they're resolved, but they might be reopened, that's a limit. if today's cooperation might be used against you in the future, that's a limit. So I think that's a first starting point, and indeed the first order answer is, okay, what's the balance of common and conflicting interests? Where do common interests occur? Where do conflicting interests occur? That will tell you something about where today's cooperation should be taking place and where it won't be taking place. And then you can go a little further and incorporate some of these other things, and maybe it tells you something about future cooperation. So I think there's a second order question that thinks about time horizons. What are today's urgent problems that might require or reward cooperation? What are tomorrow's potential concerns that may be things further down the road? And so you might cooperate today because the problems are really urgent and put aside the conflicts or the concerns about the future because your time horizon is very much focused on today. Now, I want to flag what I see as both a conceptual and a practical problem. You have to define interests. And there is sometimes a tendency to make those definitions of interest, move beyond sort of the classical type of national interest to include very extended interests. And in some cases, those extended interests might include alliances, which I think are better thought of as a means for pursuing national interests. But you will hear all the time people say the United States has an interest in its alliance relationships. So I think it is important to keep the definition of interest somewhat restricted, and not to include these extended interests, or to say there's an interest in a good relationship with Russia or an alliance with Russia. That's the dependent variable we want to know. And so you have to be careful to restrict what kind of interest you're talking about. So where I wind up, and I'll say a little bit more on the next slide, is so the better approach for doing this is what's the depth and breadth of current cooperation, and is it strategic and freely chosen? And then what is one partner's willingness to bear costs, risks, and commitments on behalf of the other partner's interests or for the sake of the strategic relationship? So this starts to get beyond a purely a transactional relationship, one where each partner is acting solely on the basis of pure self-interest, to see whether the cooperation provides evidence of a deeper degree of commitment. And again, I will stress commitment on behalf of the other partner's interests or for the sake of the strategic relationship. So I'll say a little bit more about that, but I want to flag that we're moving beyond transactional relationships based on individual self-interest, to see if there are these broader costs, risks, and commitments which indicate a broader conception of this. Let's go to the next slide. And so one way of thinking about the cooperation is, does it require and does it demonstrate strategic trust? Because gains from cooperation often involve a degree of risk. If you're willing to rely on a partner and bear the risks of deeper, more valuable cooperation, that requires strategic trust. It demonstrates strategic trust. And I think that's a useful tool in helping us assess today's cooperation and anticipate potential future strategic cooperation. So one way of thinking about that is the first layer is just transactional cooperation. Your interests, my interests, they line up. Let's work together for now on an issue by issue basis without much sense of a longer term commitment. And there absolutely can be gains from that, sometimes significant gains, but you're leaving money on the table if that's all you do. There are deeper gains from cooperation available if states specialize, if they institutionalize cooperation, if they go deeper. And so the initial gains can be based on that independent capabilities. But if you're willing to specialize and integrate capabilities, there's more synergies there to be had, more gains from cooperation. Yet at the same time, that involves greater costs if the cooperation is disrupted. So I wanted to flag the risks and costs of this. The more dependent you are on the partner, yes, there's gains from that, but that is a vulnerability. Those are costs that you pay if the cooperation is disrupted. And even if it's not disrupted, that asymmetric dependence can be a source of bargaining leverage within the relationship. So if one partner needs the other more, that can be a source of leverage. So the risks of going deeper with cooperation. Then you worry, well, what your partner gets out of it might be turned against you at some point. If their power that they gain from cooperation, if weapons they buy from you, if military skills they learn from you, that might be turned against you some way. And so how worried about that are you? I think this is a factor. This lack of trust is something that generally inhibits cooperation in sensitive military areas. And you turn that around, if you are seeing cooperation in sensitive areas, that is an indicator of trust and commitment. And then finally, the classic realist issue of relative gains. We may both benefit from trade, we may both benefit from cooperation, but who benefits more? And is that greater benefit going to turn into a difference in the balance of power? Will it affect the future balance of power need? Will it affect leverage within the relationship? Or is the cooperation helping to create your future enemy? So that is an obstacle to cooperation. And we want to know how much trust is involved. And if there is cooperation in sensitive areas, that's an indicator of trust and commitment. Let's go to the next slide. So having done all of that, where that takes me is to this framework for assessment. So sort of starting with that classic balance of common and conflicting interests. Is there a lot of it that's common? Is there a lot of conflict? That's your first order consequence for how much cooperation to expect. Then do the assessment of the breadth, depth, and strategic importance. Is it broad, institutionalized, and enduring, or issue-specific, shallow, and time-limited? And then bring in that test. Is it based on strategic motives rather than market motives or power relationships? Do we see strategic trust that might support stronger action in a future crisis or conflict? And come back to what I would argue is kind of the critical test. What's the willingness of the partners to bear costs, run risks, and make commitments on behalf of the other partner's interests or for the sake of the strategic relationship? If you see that, that's a sign of strategic commitment. And it may also imply that the interests are pretty broadly entwined and interdependent, that it's not just each country acting on the basis of narrow self-interest. Again, looking at that lens of power, how much does that affect the willingness to make independent decisions about cooperation? That gives us a gauge of whether this is freely chosen. And then kind of the bottom line for this, even if we don't have a formal security guarantee or commitment that we would find in an alliance, if we have broad, deep, and willing strategic cooperation today, that's a good indicator that we might see stronger cooperation in extreme circumstances in the future. So that's kind of where my logic takes me in this. Let's go to a couple more slides and talk a little bit about the China-Russia relationship. I think we skipped one. Actually, we can skip this slide. I think I've covered all of that. Next slide. So I wanted to throw slide 10, please. Go back one. I wanted to throw in kind of one bonus point here, which I think is applicable to the China-Russia relationship, which is whether the cooperation is based on oppositional motives. Are you responding to a threat, or constructive motives? Is there an opportunity and you're trying to build something? And I would certainly admit that the more usual way of getting to strategic cooperation is in response to a threat. That's the classic basis for the formation of alliances, coalitions, or strategic partnerships. It motivates cooperation. It encourages the partners to manage their conflicting interests and focus on dealing with the common threat. I would argue, and you may think that I have NATO in mind here, and you would not be wrong, that there's an irony of success, that if strategic cooperation really works, it will diminish a threat over time. That erodes the basis for cooperation, and it tends to bring conflicting interests to the fore. So if it's a threat that produces the alliance, once the threat goes, the alliance should go too. That's the John Mearsheimer prediction of this. Uh, Conversely, I would say that constructive cooperation is in response to an opportunity. There's gains and synergies there that motivate the partners to cooperate. There's a potential virtuous circle there as gains from cooperation manifest and the value of being part of this group increases. That can provide an enduring basis for cooperation over time as the benefits accrue to the partners, the collective strategic weight of the partnership increases its value and influence. And that may be such a good thing that other people want to be part of it. So it attracts new members and you get kind of the gains from that. And then obviously, again, with NATO in mind, cooperation can start as threat-based, but if it generates significant gains, if it shows significant value, it can endure even after the threat is diminished or even if it's gone away entirely. So that's the refutation for Mearsheimer, if you like. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about China specifically, and I have my eye on the clock, and I'll get us there. Uh, so China's strategic partnerships, they mean certain things by them, and I want to use that word a little bit more broadly. These are China's post-Cold War substitute for alliances. They have a fairly elaborate hierarchy of them that goes from partnerships to strategic partnerships to comprehensive strategic partnerships. I think we counted about 17 different labels for them, but I think these are the three that matter. Typically, it's focused on the overall bilateral relationship. It will include a menu of planned cooperation that's diplomatic, economic, and military. Importantly, it does not include binding security guarantees or commitments. So there's an agenda for cooperation, but not a commitment on the security side. And having studied these for a while, I would say that there's been an evolution of them over time. They start out being about great powers and countries on China's periphery. Over time, it broadens to include major regional powers. And then I would argue it devolves into part of the standard Chinese diplomatic toolkit. And the labels don't mean so much anymore. But if you're a Chinese ambassador to any country, what's your goal for your tour? I want to establish a strategic partnership. I want to upgrade it to a comprehensive strategic partnership. That's how I will know my time in the country has been successful. The problem is these labels, I don't think, help us that much in assessing alignment, partly because they started out with a strategic focus and that's devolved over time. But I think we see upgrades in the level of partnership that are very common. But when problems emerge in the relationship, say with South Korea, say with Australia, the label doesn't go away. It doesn't downgrade to reflect the reality of the relationship. So it's not a great indicator. And then there's various empirical research on how much does this matter in terms of cooperation. I think it shows pretty limited real world predictive value. And if you parse it quantitatively, what you see is the relationship with Russia and Pakistan are the ones that have the most cooperation, the deepest cooperation. But I think if you take those out of the regressions, most of the rest doesn't have much predictive value. And you can think about that among other things, that China doesn't have partnerships with either Japan or the United States, but has a lot of interactions with them. So I don't think China's own labels are all that helpful for us. Let's go to the next slide. There have been a couple good China-Russia frameworks. Alexander Korlev from 2019 has this escalating series of cooperation. At the top, a common defense policy and different layers of this. If we go to the next slide, Oriana Mastro has an interesting one. The table is too complicated really to reproduce here, but it gives you a sense of the types of things that she thinks are important in judging cooperation, where they fly, and she has criteria for assessing it as low, medium, or high, and whether there's nothing happening, China doing things, Russia doing things, both of them doing changes. I'm not going to present that finding. Let's go to the next slide. But I think what we see from these empirical studies are pretty similar things. They find significant cooperation. They find an increase in military cooperation and a greater willingness to publicize it after 2014, 2015. And that, of course, is the Russian invasion of Crimea. That is the souring of the US-China relationship, which becomes very evident in 2015. You see military cooperation between China and Russia sort of stuck at an intermediate level. A Russia that's reluctant to share sensitive military technologies with China, a China that's reluctant to endorse and support Russian military attacks in Ukraine. On balance, I think the best work on this suggests that the relationship remains transactional in nature. Each side is calibrating cooperation on the basis of its own national interests. That suggests their limits and how far they will go. And I have the bottom slide here in September, right as I went to Europe to brief this. Then Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell made some remarks about a increased Russian willingness to share sensitive military technologies with China. Nobody I could find in NATO really understood what this meant, by the way. But that's a question. Does this change the assessment? On balance, I don't think it really does. I think there are still reluctance to share technologies. Let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to wrap up. So this is part of a broader project to try to understand China's strategic relations with other countries. And I suggested we can't use China's own partnership labels to do that. We have to have an independent assessment. This is a challenging task because China's partnerships are not traditional alliances. They don't include explicit security commitments. We have to make our own judgments about the degree of commitment and what kind of cooperation it will support tomorrow based on the kind of cooperation we see today. And I have tried in this presentation and paper to present a rough framework for doing that assessment of today's cooperation, the focus on breadth, depth, and importance, and especially on each partner's willingness to take on costs, run risks, make commitments to advance the other partner's interests. And I think that degree of commitment to the other partner's interests, to the strategic relationship, provides the best indicator we can get on the limits of future strategic cooperation. So this is an effort by me to think it through. In November 2024, we did a conference, the CAPS-RAN NDU USIP conference, that focused on this, focused on understanding China's strategic relationships. We had conceptual and empirical papers, including this one, including one on China's behavior in multilateral security relations. We had 8 bilateral papers that looked at specific relationships. And you see the countries there: Russia, North Korea, India, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Tanzania, chosen partly on the basis that for many of these there is cooperation underway and we wanted to assess it. India as an interesting anomalous case that cooperates with China but also competes with it. We have all the members of the so-called axis of evil, or whatever we want to call it. And we have major regional powers there as well. I will preempt the question, why Tanzania? Why Tanzania? Because that is China's closest strategic relationship in Africa, the longest standing one that supports very significant military cooperation. And we had an analyst who had incredible access to Tanzania and had spent time there asking these questions. So we picked a great analyst on a great case for that. And then a couple papers focused on Taiwan. The intent is the papers are looking at similar types of interactions and strategic cooperation between China and the countries involved. They're making some use of the analytic framework that I presented for you today. What our goal in revisions is to integrate the framework a little bit more into the bilateral case studies, and then to come away with some big picture conclusions that assess each of those relationships according to the framework and see where things fall. So let me stop there, having presented the framework, put it into context, and invite questions either about the conceptual side or practical empirical questions.